Welcome to Books Brews Light, number 40. We are here with Dr. Bob. Is it Thiel or Thiel?
Thiel, the German way.
Okay. And I think in this country, it's a toss-up if people are going to say it more the American way or without the H. So welcome, Dr. Thiel, or is it okay if I call you Bob?
Yeah, that's fine. Whatever you want to call me.
Okay, so Bob is the author of a very interesting book called The Last Pope of Malachy Prophecy, ? Do biblical and Roman Catholic prophecies point to Pope Leo XIV? And so, first of all, you have a very impressive background in your education in faith and theology. Can you kind of go through some of that?
Sure. It's actually kind of funny. One of the reasons I was in the military. One of the reasons that I didn't want to go to college, supposedly. I mean, that was what was going through my head. And the reality is, when I got in the military, I realized I need to have degrees. So I have an AA in liberal arts. I have a BS in accounting. I have a MS from USC in information systems management. I have a Ph.D. from Union Institute in the university in nutrition science. And I have a Ph.D. in early Christianity from Calvin Graduate School. So, my education has covered a lot of different fields.
Right.
If bore you with something odd, the first time I actually flunked a test in my life, I failed an aptitude test.
And what was the aptitude test for?
Just to see what kind of work you should do or something, I guess. So I asked my counselor, how did you fail an aptitude test?
Right.
She says to me, you only fail an aptitude test if you don't pay attention or your answers contradict. I said, I did pay attention. She said, take the test again. Guess what? That's right, I flunked twice. And and only one other person in the class flunked, and she was the bottom of the class. And in that class, I was the top of the class. And
that's funny.
Yeah. The reason I think I flunked it is that I had wanted to go in the military. I wanted to teach. By the way, I have lifetime teacher credentials. I had wanted to go into business. I was vice president of a heavy manufacturing company. I wanted to write. I've written zillions of books. I wanted to do information, television, radio. I've been a radio guest like 240 times, and I'm on a weekly radio program now as well. So apparently, when they set up an aptitude test, they didn't think there would be people who like to do lots of things.
That's hilarious. And I think that if I took that same test, I would fail, because that's exactly the reason. I've lived a very straight, narrow life, as I've often said, and yet I've been kicked out of a lot of things, which to me is hilarious. But one of the things I was kicked out of was the youth symphony. Now, I majored in music. I played trombone from the time I was in sixth grade, and I added an instrument every year, taught myself how to play it. And so here I am, like, I am the last person who should ever get kicked out of the youth symphony. But the problem was I joined both of them in Minneapolis, and they had a concert on the same day, almost at the same time. Now, Gitsy's, the Greater Twin Cities Youth Symphony, said they had 5 trombones and you only need 3 to cover the parts. And they were the ones who said, if you don't show up for the concert, you're going to be kicked out. Whereas the Minnesota Youth Orchestra was, I think, a little more professional. They had it set up like an actual professional orchestra. You've got 3 trombones. So my part was needed. They weren't going to kick me out if I missed, but my part was needed. So I went to them, packed up, got driven across Minneapolis to where the other one was playing, and got there just as my group came off stage. So they kicked me out. So I see that as a little similar. I wanted to do too much. And my trombone professor was always telling me, you have to quit doing so much. And I'm like, but I want to act in the plays. I want to do this. I want to do that. I want to be writing books. And he never could convince me. And maybe he was right, because I'm not a professional trombonist, whereas my friend in the low brass studio who listened to his advice is. So I do appreciate your story. And so with all this background in faith, I am kind of curious, is prophecy, how is that regarded in these sort of upper echelons of the faith world, of theology and academic study and so on?
It generally negatively. As a matter of fact, talking about the Bible, for example, one of the books of the Bible, the book of Daniel, modern scholars basically claim that it couldn't have been written when the Bible suggests it was written because it was too accurate.
Oh, that's funny. That's like circular logic.
Exactly correct. So that's one issue that you run into. So that's an issue. And like on the Malachy prophecies, we're going to talk about in this book. I went to Wikipedia today just for fun, and it basically said, consensus of scholars is the Malachy prophecy was a fraud perpetrated in the 1590s. Now, for your listeners and viewers here, let me explain what this has to do with anything. All right. In the 12th century, in the year 1139, an Irish bishop by the name of Malachy heads to Rome. And so he goes there, and just around the time he gets there, he claims to have a vision. And he writes down a few words in Latin about future popes. And turns out he wrote about 112 of them.
Mm-hmm.
And the list was very accurate. But they say that it was a fraud, that because they found it in the 16th century, that sure, somebody just went and wrote all this stuff beforehand, and that's why it was so accurate. Now, if what came later was not accurate, then I would agree it was a fraud. I don't believe it's a fraud. Now, lest I offend people, I don't believe it was from God either. I think it's satanic, but that's not the point.
Okay.
The point is, do I think he received some kind of a vision that he wrote things down? Yes. Has a lot of what he said come to pass? Yes. Does everything he's going to write for the future have to come to pass? No. Do I think, however, some of this more stuff is going to happen? The answer is yes. So that ties into that. So within academia and upper echelons of a lot of religions, they don't like the idea of prophecy. Now, that's bizarre for people who claim to be Christian.
I think so.
Well, I'll give it more specifically. The Apostle Paul said, do not despise prophecy. Okay, in Thessalonians. Right. Okay, so that's why I cringe when people, particularly people who claim to be academics, discount the Bible or discount prophecy. Now, as far as discounting the Bible, let me head over to something else. The book of Exodus. All right. Now, if you go to Wikipedia, and I haven't checked it this year yet, but pretty much it says the following about the Exodus. The Exodus is the founding myth of the children of Israel. And they say this because they say the Exodus happened in the year 1250, and there's no BCE, and there's no evidence it happened in the year 1250 BCE. Therefore, it did not happen. It says, now there is a view it happened perhaps in 1448 BCE, but we discount that. Okay, the problem is the 1448 rough or approximate one is actually accurate. That's probably when the Exodus was, and there actually is evidence out there, even within the Egyptian records, which is bizarre because you asked about academia. I just watched something, I don't know, History Channel, Science Channel, some documentary channel, right? And they made some comment about that there was no evidence of the plagues of Egypt, etc., in Egyptian writings. And that's not true. There's actually something called the Ipuwer Papyrus that says it. Now, the reason I say all this is for you and your listeners is to not be intimidated by people with lots of degrees after their name. Now, and I am one of these people, okay?
Right, but I think that's, yes, obviously. And I think some people are very guilty of deliberately using their titles and degrees to say whatever they want you to believe. And I find it very peculiar that they would say there is no evidence, therefore it didn't happen. I mean, that's logical fallacy.
Yes, and you see it.
Doesn't everybody know that?
You would think so. I actually was an editor for Wikipedia 30 years ago, and then on theology. And some of the articles they have, I originated. Back then, Wikipedia claimed to have no point of view. So,
Right.
and I would put quotes from the 2nd century. Okay. Now, for your listeners, Jesus was here in the 1st century. The New Testament was written in the 1st century. So the 2nd century people, in my opinion, knew the native language better than people do now.
I would think.
Of course. All right.
But we are very arrogant in our day and age, so I'm not surprised there are people who question that.
Right. So I wanted to write something about early Christianity. I quoted some stuff, and later that got yanked.
Mm-hmm.
I better watch it. I'll never get to this topic because I have a bunch of stuff I could go on this.
I have to throw in a funny story about Wikipedia, though, and I think
Please.
it's so important that people do not take Wikipedia too seriously. I forget who it was. It was some public figure. It might have been a radio show host or someone like that. It might have been an author of a book whose viewpoint was not appreciated by Wikipedia. And so there was this article about him. It said something that was just blatantly false. I don't know if it was an accusation or whatever it was. And he went in and he edited it, and they changed it back within minutes. He re-edited to say the factual thing about his life. They changed it back. And finally, they said to him, we need a source to prove that you know what you're talking about. He said, I am the source. The article is about me. I am this person. I know my own life. And they're like, nope, and changed it back to what wasn't true. I wish I could remember the details, but it was quite the story about how they say what they want.
That's not isolated. They are so biased. I'm talking about prophecy for a second. I wrote a book called Lost Tribes and Prophecy, right? And I went to Wikipedia. Now, there's a woman called Thiel, okay? And there's various stories and legends about her. And Wikipedia, though, said that she was invented by somebody in the 19th century. All right?
Who is she?
Thiel was a princess. She's believed to have married one of the Hebrew who descended from one of the peoples. Okay, so she was in Ireland. She was around, according to legend, when Jeremiah went there. Okay, so that's who she is. But in Wikipedia, they said she's an invention from the 19th century. All right, now I went and found a document from, the 7th century and the 14th century that quoted her. It was actually written in Gaelic. Now, by the way, Gaelic, just a few words, are not very hard to read. In my book, I actually show you in the Gaelic text. It says something like Tia Tefi most beautiful or something. Okay? There's no way a guy in the 19th century invented her.
Right.
But I fixed it in Wikipedia. They changed it back. I fixed it again. And the second time, they had something in there, but still made it sound like I was wrong. And it bizarre. And the reason I'm bringing that one up is because it had to do with prophecy. Because some of us believe that certain promises to the old tribes of Israel are for our time, and Tia Tefi is a player in this whole process.
Okay.
But we didn't invent her. And she certainly wasn't an invention in the 19th century. And that's a fact. But I can understand about arguing about opinions, but these are facts.
Never mind. My oldest son was an editor on Wikipedia for a long time, and he finally gave up because he said every time, it didn't matter how much he cited sources, gave the evidence, they would just change it back to whatever they wanted to say. And that's, it's really scary because people are basing ideas and opinions and actions on what they're reading and not realizing that it's very biased.
And it's not just Wikipedia. I don't know if we'll ever get to the book, but
we will.
With Wikipedia, though, it's not just that. It's also the AI programs. I wrote a book put out a year or so ago called Islamic and Biblical Prophecies for the 21st Century. Now, I tell you that because when I was doing some research and I would go into AI programs, They were very deferential to Islam. They were not toward Christianity. They, a couple of times, gave me a intentionally wrong translation of Arabic. Now, I'm not an Arabic scholar, okay? But I actually had to tell, I think it was Bing Copilot, that I think it was Bing, yeah, that a Microsoft program had said that this was right. And then finally, it agreed that the translation was correct. And it's actually an important translation as far as Islam goes. Islam doesn't believe Jesus died, all right? But the Quran actually says he did. Unfortunately, 6 of the 7 translations into English don't have that, but one does. And I had to go back to the Arabic to see if that was true. And I kept getting wrong answers from AI until they finally admitted I was right.
That's interesting. Right. And again, very important. So let's go back to Malachy. You had talked about, I'm trying to remember what I knew prior, but I think he named, like he gave a kind of nickname to each of the 112 popes and like a little blurb about who that pope would be. Okay. So give me just a few examples of some of them in the past.
Sure. Now, what's funny is I bought a book a long time ago called the Malachy Prophecies. It was written in like 1968 or 9. Okay. So the guy who wrote that book mentioned a few people up until his time and why it met. Now, that book hasn't been rewritten, but since then we had a few popes. There was one called Of the Half Moon. Okay. I won't try to, I took Latin in high school, but I'm not going to try to pronounce them in Latin. Okay. Well, it turns out Pope John Paul I came in on a half moon and died a month later on a half moon.
Oh, wow. Okay.
So that was one that was interesting. Then the next one was called In the Labor of the Sun. And that was John Paul II, who actually I saw in person once.
Oh, that's cool. He looked just like my grandpa, which, well, enough so that when my grandparents, I'm trying to remember if they visited Italy or Rome, he was frequently stopped. And people stopped him and said, "You look just like the Pope." And they were of a similar age at the time. He was a little bit older than John Paul II. But anyway, go ahead.
Okay, so his was called Of the Labor of the Sun. And some other, I guess Roman Catholic interpreted this to say, you know, he was born on a solar eclipse. He either died or was buried on the solar eclipse.
Okay.
So you can kind of connect it. Now the next one was for the glory of the olives. And the Olivetan order, or the Benedictines are the Olivetan order. And they've always said that they were going to get a pope. Well, they didn't quite get one, but they got a guy named Benedict. So Benedictine kind of ties. Now here's what gets tricky about these prophecies. One of the things is that over a century ago, and even in that book in the 1960s I told you about, they both said Malachy didn't say there were no people between number 111 and 112. It's assumed that's what he meant, but it doesn't say that.
Right. So, and just in case we haven't clarified within this interview, in theory, Francis would have been the 112th, making Leo the 113th. And that's what you're about to lead into, just for anyone who doesn't know that background.
Exactly right. Now, interestingly, an educated Roman Catholic writer, he was not a priest, but he had at least a master's degree, wrote earlier this year that Francis was not on Malachy's list. Now, there's a couple of reasons, though, why, in one respect, he could be considered, he meaning Leo, number 112. One is, as I told you before, they said there could be anybody in between, so they don't count. But the other one was when Francis was elected, Benedict was still alive. So many people, not a huge number, but there's people out there that say, wait, Francis doesn't count. You can't be canonically elected if there's another pope, and there's another pope, so he didn't count. Therefore, Leo is number 112. Okay? Whether or not he is or was, Malachy had a prophecy about the different popes. And the one that's got people the most concerned has to do with number 112. Now, I had all kinds of sections I was going to read. I'll skip through some of these, try to get to one that I think would be a little more relevant. Here's one before I get to it. There's a lot of Roman Catholic prophecies that point to the time where an anti-pope was going to be elected. Okay. Now, the usual definition of an anti-pope is two people claiming to be pope at the same time. But over a dozen years ago, I said, well, what if someone just pretends to be Roman Catholic? Wouldn't that make him an anti-pope? And actually, according to the Roman Catholic leading exorcist, that was an issue that affected the Vatican a while back. And so my speculation on that was confirmed by other Roman Catholics. Now, I could read a bunch of Roman Catholic prophecies about anti-popes, but let me skip that for the time being. Okay, this is the half moon stuff. I got into that. I want to go into something that was actually covered recently about the Malachy prophecy list, and that has to do with the year 2027. Okay. Euro News, and I think the Jerusalem Post, and a couple other places went out and they warned that in 2020, because of the Malachy prophecies, we could have doom in 2027. Okay, so I'm going to read. Actually, it's going to be from. It's in my book, but this is from Euro News.
Okay.
According to a 900-year-old book in the Vatican, Judgment Day may soon be upon us. According to the 12th century book credited to the Irish bishop Saint Malachy, it's going to take place in 2027. The book contains a series of Latin phrases and 112 mysterious sections, which purport to predict the Catholic popes beginning from Celestine II up until the current pope. One passage attributed to Pope Sixtus reads, "Axle in the middle of a sign." Pope Sixtus' tenure began 442 years after the first pope's rule. This passage suggests he's in the middle of the papal lineage, thus indicating the end of the world would come 442 years later in the year 2027. Now, before I go any further on that, I think this is a stretch. I think this is how people interpret Nostradamus' prophecies. Okay, they look for stuff that I don't really think is necessarily there.
Right,
so,
right.
I didn't read it to be this. The fact that he's an axle in the midst doesn't necessarily mean that. And I want to make it clear to your listeners, I do not believe the end, meaning the start of the Great Tribulation, can happen in 2027. I think it's too soon. There's other signs Jesus said to look for. They're not there yet. Okay. So, but anyway, then they quote the last Pope information from the Malachy prophecy. And here's this translation of it. In the final persecution of the Holy Roman Church, there will reign Peter the Roman, who will feed his flock amid many tribulations, after which the seven-hilled city will be destroyed. The dreadful judge will judge the people, the end. And then this article says the seven-hilled city refers to Rome. And that's true. And that's consistent with prophecies, for example, in the 17th chapter of the book of Revelation. So, I mean, that's kind of the gist of it.
Right. Now, I wanted to ask, I was doing a little reading on your website, and I think I was also doing a little reading on Garabandal. So hopefully I'm getting it right, what I read where. But I think you were talking about how saying somebody is the last pope doesn't mean there won't be any more popes, or did I read that on the other site?
No, I believe that the final pope will most likely be the final Antichrist, and he will also betray the Church of Rome.
Okay.
It's possible somebody else might rise up and call themselves that, but I don't think that would be of any significance. I think the last one will be basically the last real.
Okay. Okay. It might have been on Garabandal. Are you familiar with the prophecies and the events of Garabandal in the 1960s?
Only to a small degree. I've read a couple of them.
I think it's interesting.
I read a book that covered some of them.
It's interesting how they connect with Malachy, and I have my notes here so I get this just right. I believe it was Conchita was one of the main visionaries. She's still alive today. She's in her 70s.
Yes.
And when she heard that, I believe it was John the 23rd died, she immediately said, without thinking, there are only 3 popes left. And she said she had been told that by Mary, who then later clarified, well, technically there are 4, but one of them is so brief that, we're not counting that one.
And that would
And
tie in
so,
with the John Paul I.
right, exactly. And I guess I have no clue of my listeners how many of them would even remember John Paul I, because he lived, 30 days after his election?
Yeah, there's rumors that he was poisoned, but others say he had a heart attack.
Right. And who knows? I mean, politics infects churches too, unfortunately. But so after John the 23rd, there was Paul the 6th, John Paul the 1st, who was only 30 days, John Paul the 2nd, and Benedict the 16th. And so I found that interesting, combined with Malachy and this idea that Francis doesn't really count. But even if that's true, we're now on to Leo, who would make 4, or is that
Right.
5 popes? So, but I did find it interesting that Garabandal and Malachy do seem to kind of dovetail in that respect. And I was curious, on your thoughts on that.